the princess queen forsaken. Only the human soldier remained. The kingdom of Elendor stood as a monument to ancient power. A proud city ruled by a dynasty of kings and queens who had shaped the fate of the realm for centuries. Its towers stretched toward the heavens, and its people, the Elendorians, were known for their loyalty, honor, and bravery. The royal family, with its deep connection to the land, had guided the kingdom through countless challenges. But all of it was about to change in an instant. Elara, the princess of Elendor, had always known that one day the weight of the kingdom would rest upon her shoulders. As the only child of the aging King Dragon, she was expected to one day inherit the throne. Her childhood had been filled with the lessons of leadership, diplomacy, and the unspoken expectation to be everything her ancestors had been. Her father, despite his growing frailty, had always been a figure of strength and wisdom. Elara had loved him deeply, and in her heart she had always believed that together they would continue to guide Elendor toward an even brighter future. But the shadows of betrayal had been growing long, and they had crept into the heart of the royal court. It was an early morning when the kingdom's fate was sealed. The sound of battle echoed from the city walls, and soon the throne room itself was under attack. Elara had been preparing for her daily duties when her father's trusted guards rushed into her chambers, their faces pale with terror. The royal family had been betrayed by its closest allies. The noble houses of Elendor had turned on each other, and now an enemy force had breached the city gates. "Princess, you must leave immediately," one of the guards had urged, his voice frantic. "Your father. He has fallen." Elara's world crumbled in that moment. Her father, the king who had ruled with unshakable resolve, was gone, and with his death, so too was the kingdom she had known. The enemy was relentless, and the throne room fell into chaos as soldiers, once loyal, turned their weapons against the royal family. "Come, princess," the guard called, gripping her arm and pulling her toward the hidden escape route. But Elara resisted. She could hear the sounds of battle growing louder, the cries of the fallen echoing through the corridors. It was all happening too fast. Her gaze fell upon the portrait of her father, which still hung proudly on the wall. She could almost feel his presence, as if he was still watching over her. But the reality of the situation struck her like a physical blow. The world she had known was gone, and with it, her dreams of leading Elendor to greatness. "Go now," the guard urged once again, his voice breaking. Reluctantly, Elara allowed herself to be pulled away. Her heart raced as they navigated the narrow, winding corridors of the palace. The enemy had already breached the outer walls, and the palace was no longer safe. She had no choice but to flee. As they neared the secret passageway, another figure appeared in the doorway, a tall, broad-shouldered man in the uniform of the royal guard. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Captain Kane," the guard exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You've survived." The man nodded, though his expression was grim. "The enemy has already taken the city, but they haven't found you yet, princess. You must come with me." Captain Thomas Kane was not from Elendor. He was human, a foreigner who had risen through the ranks of the royal guard through sheer merit. Though many had questioned his presence in the royal court, none could deny his skill. Kane was known for his unmatched swordsmanship and his calm demeanor in the face of danger. He had earned the respect of both the royal family and the people of Elendor, though he never fully embraced the life of a courtier. Elara had met Kane many years ago when she was still a child. He had been one of her father's most trusted commanders, a protector of the royal family. Over the years, their paths had crossed countless times, but it was always in the context of duty. Despite his stoic nature, there was a quiet understanding between them. He was the soldier, and she was the princess. It was a relationship bound by respect, not affection. But now, in the face of the kingdom's fall, Thomas Kane was the only person left who could offer her any hope of survival. "Your father," Elara began, her voice trembling. "Is he really gone?" Kane's expression hardened. "Yes, princess, the king is dead. And the kingdom is lost, but you are not. You still have a chance to escape." Elara's heart sank. She had known her father's time was coming, but to hear the words spoken so bluntly was a harsh reality she hadn't been prepared for. She had never expected her life to change so suddenly, so violently. "I don't know what to do," Elara whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "The kingdom, everything I've known, is gone." Kane's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "You are the last of your bloodline, princess. The future of Elendor rests on your shoulders even if the kingdom is in ruins. We can't afford to mourn. We must leave now." The urgency in his voice snapped Alara out of her daze. She glanced back at the throne room where the sounds of the enemy grew louder. There was no time to grieve, no time for anything but survival. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a safe house in the eastern mountains," Cain replied. "It's remote, far from the reach of the enemy. From there, we can regroup and figure out what to do next." Alara nodded, her mind still spinning with the weight of everything that had happened. She followed Cain through the secret passage, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the darkened halls of the palace. Her heart ached as she thought of the people she had failed, her father, her kingdom, her people. But she knew there was no time for doubt. As they emerged into the night, the air was thick with smoke. The city of Elendor was burning, its once proud walls reduced to rubble. Alara's eyes stung from the smoke, and her heart ached with the loss of everything she had known. But the world had changed, and there was no turning back. "Come," Cain urged, his voice steady. "We have a long journey ahead of us." And so, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the man who had once been her protector by her side, Alara began the long, uncertain path into exile. The princess was gone, and in her place, a woman who would have to learn to survive in a world that no longer held any place for her. The journey into the wilderness began under the cover of night. Alara, the last princess of Elendor, walked beside Thomas Cain, the soldier who had pledged to protect her. The remnants of the kingdom were far behind them now, the city of Elendor consumed by the flames of war, its once grand towers now nothing more than smoking ruins. As the pair traveled through the dense forests that lay beyond the city, Alara could hear the distant sounds of the chaos they had left behind, the cries of her people, the clashing of swords, the mournful sound of the kingdom's final breaths. Though the night was calm, a deep sadness lingered in the air. Alara's heart felt heavy, weighed down by the loss of everything she had known. The palace, her father, the court, everything had crumbled in a matter of hours. She had been thrust into the unknown, with only Thomas by her side, the human soldier who had never been part of her world but had become her only ally in the chaos. As they walked, the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a faint glow on the forest floor. The dense woods seemed to close in around them, an endless sea of shadows and whispers. Alara had never ventured this far from the palace grounds before. It was an unfamiliar world, wild and untamed, far removed from the comfort and safety of her royal life. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of an owl in the distance. "We should keep moving," Cain said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, his tone unflinching. "We can't afford to rest here for long. The enemy will be searching for us." Alara nodded without speaking. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The weight of the day's events had drained her, and the cold night air did nothing to ease the aching in her chest. She longed to find a place to rest, to grieve the loss of her kingdom and her father, but there was no time for such luxuries. Survival came first now, and that meant pressing forward, even when every step felt like an impossible burden. Thomas led the way, his eyes scanning the path ahead. Though he had grown up in a distant land, far from the kingdom of Elendor, he knew how to navigate through the wilderness. His military training had taught him the art of survival, and it was this knowledge that would keep them alive in the days to come. For all of his stoic demeanor, Alara could sense that Thomas, too, carried the weight of their situation. He had not asked for this task, and yet he had taken it upon himself to protect her. Despite the clear danger, there was a sense of loyalty in his actions, a fierce determination to see her through the storm. Alara struggled to keep up with him, her royal gown torn and muddy from the hasty escape. She had never imagined that she would find herself in such a state. The princess of Elendor, running through the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back, hiding from enemies who had once been her allies. The reality of her situation was too much to grasp, too much to accept. She was no longer a princess. She was a fugitive, a woman with no home, no purpose, and no future. After several hours of walking, the thick forest began to open up, revealing a small clearing bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Cain stopped for a moment, turning to face Alara. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice practical as always. "It's not much, but it'll have to do for the night." Alara nodded and sank to the ground, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so physically drained. Her body ached, and her mind refused to stop spinning with thoughts of everything she had lost. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring into the fire Cain had started, watching the flames dance in the night. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled and popped as the two of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ilara's mind was consumed by the image of her father, the king who had always been so strong, so sure of himself. How could he be gone? How could she be the last of her bloodline? She had always known that one day she would be called upon to lead Elendor, but she had never imagined that she would be forced to do so in such circumstances. Her eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to show weakness in front of Cain. She didn't want him to see her as vulnerable. He had always been the soldier, the protector, and she had been the princess. They had never been equals, not really. And now, in the wake of the kingdom's fall, she wasn't sure what role she was meant to play anymore. "Thomas," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Cain glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's my duty," he said simply. "I swore an oath to protect you and your family." "That oath doesn't end just because the palace falls." Ilara nodded, but she still didn't fully understand. She had been taught that loyalty and duty were important virtues, but she had never considered how they could shape a person's actions in such a way. Thomas had risked everything for her, for a kingdom that was no longer his own. And yet, despite all the danger they faced, he had stayed by her side, leading her through the wilderness with a steady hand. She wanted to say something to thank him for his unwavering loyalty, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? She didn't even know who she was anymore. The Princess of Elendor was gone, replaced by a woman on the run, a woman with no purpose except to survive. As the night wore on, Ilara eventually succumbed to the weariness that had taken hold of her. She leaned back against a tree and closed her eyes, the sound of the crackling fire lulling her into a restless sleep. The world outside seemed so far away, so distant, as if it no longer mattered. All that mattered now was the present, the uncertain future that awaited them both. When Ilara awoke, it was still dark, though the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep over the horizon. Cain was still awake, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. He hadn't slept at all. "We should move before daylight," Cain said, his voice low and firm. "The enemy will be looking for us. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long." Ilara nodded, though her body screamed for rest. There was no time for that, however. The world had changed, and she had to change with it. She had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy her heart felt. The journey was far from over. They had barely begun. Days passed as Ilara and Thomas continued their journey through the wilderness, the dense forest stretching endlessly before them. The air grew colder as they ventured further from the remnants of Elendor, and the landscape changed with each passing mile. The once familiar, regal beauty of the kingdom was replaced by untamed nature, wild animals, thick trees, and rushing rivers. There was no sign of the life Ilara had once known, only the quiet hum of the wilderness. Though she was still recovering from the shock of her father's death and the fall of her kingdom, Ilara found herself slowly adjusting to her new reality. The weight of her royal blood seemed distant now, replaced by the urgent need to survive. She had never been trained for life outside the palace walls, but with every step she grew stronger, more aware of the world she had once taken for granted. Thomas, too, had shown her a side of herself she never knew existed. His quiet strength and unwavering determination had become the foundation on which she now stood. Though they had traveled together for days, they had rarely spoken. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather a shared understanding. Thomas, a soldier through and through, was not one to offer reassurances or comfort. He simply did what needed to be done, without question or complaint. As the days wore on, Ilara began to notice something shifting within her. There was a growing sense of purpose, of duty, not as a princess, but as someone who had survived when everyone else had fallen. She was no longer the fragile, sheltered royal who had once been the center of attention in the grand halls of the palace. She had become something else, something stronger. On the fourth day of their journey, they arrived at the edge of a small village nestled against a rocky mountain range. The village was a far cry from the bustling streets of Elendor, but it had a kind of quiet resilience about it. The houses were simple, made from wood and stone, and the people appeared to be hardworking folk, farmers, hunters, and artisans. Alara could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they watched the pair approach, but there was also a guarded curiosity. As they passed through the village, Alara's gaze lingered on the faces of the people, rough, weathered faces that spoke of hardship and struggle. They were not royalty, nor did they have the comfort of the palace, but they had managed to survive. There was a strength in them, something raw and unyielding. Alara found herself admiring it. Thomas stopped at a small market stall and spoke briefly with an elderly man who appeared to be the village leader. Alara stood back, watching them from a distance. She could not hear their conversation, but she could see the way the man nodded slowly, as though weighing something heavy in his mind. When they finished, Thomas turned to Alara. "We'll stay here for the night," he said. "The people are hesitant, but they will let us rest. We can't keep moving through the wilderness without food and shelter. Tomorrow we head into the mountains." Alara nodded. She was too tired to argue. The long days of travel had worn her down, and the thought of rest, even if just for a few hours, was a welcome relief. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the village seemed to come alive in a quiet, peaceful way. The people gathered around small fires, sharing food and stories. Alara and Thomas sat near the edge of the village, away from the others. Alara wrapped herself in a worn cloak that Thomas had given her, feeling the cool night air on her face. Despite the warmth of the fire, she felt a deep ache in her chest, a longing for the life she had lost. Thomas sat beside her, his eyes focused on the fire. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked. Alara glanced at him. His face was shadowed, but his expression was unreadable. "I'm just thinking," she replied softly, "about everything that's happened, about what comes next." Thomas nodded, his gaze never leaving the flames. "There's nothing wrong with thinking," he said, "but you can't let it consume you. We don't have the luxury of time, and neither do the people who are still out there." Alara looked around at the village. Despite its simplicity, there was a sense of safety here, a kind of stability that Elendor had lost. For the first time since the fall of her kingdom, Alara felt a flicker of hope. "I never imagined I would be in a place like this," Alara admitted. "The Princess of Elendor out here in the wilderness, surrounded by people who have nothing." Thomas looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. "The world doesn't care about titles," he said, his voice steady. "You can't change what's happened, but you can still decide what you do with the future." Alara thought about his words for a long time, watching the flames dance in front of her. She had been raised to believe that her bloodline meant something, that her royal status gave her power over others. But now, as she sat beside a soldier who had once been a stranger to her, she realized that power was not something inherited, it was something earned. Later that night, after the village had settled into an uneasy sleep, Thomas came to her again. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Alara stood up and followed him to a secluded spot behind a nearby building, away from the prying eyes of the villagers. "What is it?" she asked. "There's something you need to know," Thomas said, his voice serious. "We're not just running from the enemy. There's more to this than you realize." Alara frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked around, making sure no one was watching, then stepped closer. "I've been in contact with a group of rebels. They're scattered across the region, fighting back against the invaders. Some of them were once loyal to your father. They've been waiting for a signal, a sign that the royal family still lives, that there's hope for Elendor." Alara's heart skipped a beat. The idea that there were people out there, still loyal to her father, still fighting for Elendor's future, filled her with both relief and fear. She had always thought she was alone, that there was no one left to carry on her family's legacy. But if there were rebels, people still willing to fight for her kingdom, then maybe there was still a chance. "Do you think they'll help us?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded. "They're not doing it for you, Princess. They're doing it for the future of Elendor. But yes, they'll help. We just have to find them." Alara took a deep breath. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle in, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. She was no longer just the last princess of Elendor. She was a symbol of hope, of resistance, and maybe, just maybe, she could help bring the kingdom back from the ashes. "We find them," she said, her voice firm. "We find the rebels, and we fight." Thomas gave her a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "We'll fight, Princess. We'll fight until there's nothing left to fight for." The days that followed were filled with tension. Ilara and Thomas moved deeper into the mountains, seeking the rebels Thomas had spoken of. The journey was harder now, with the terrain growing rougher and the days shorter. The cold of the mountain air bit at their skin, and the nights felt colder than ever before. But even in this harsh, unforgiving landscape, Ilara felt a strange sense of determination growing inside her. She had begun to realize that this was no longer about finding safety or shelter. This was about survival. And not just her survival, but the survival of everything her father had worked for. Elendor might have fallen, but it hadn't disappeared. There was still a chance to fight, to rebuild, to reclaim everything they had lost, and she would do whatever it took to make that happen. Thomas, for his part, had kept up his role as protector and guide. His eyes remained sharp, scanning the path ahead for danger. He had become more than just a soldier in Ilara's eyes. He had become a lifeline, the one person she could count on in this world that no longer seemed familiar. Though they had not spoken much in the past days, there was an unspoken bond between them now, an understanding that, no matter what came, they would face it together. The journey took them through thick forests and across rivers that flowed like ice. The further they traveled, the more distant Elendor seemed. It was hard for Ilara to think of her kingdom as it had once been, a place of grandeur and power where her father had ruled with wisdom and strength. Now it felt like a far-off memory, something unreachable. But the rebels were out there. They had to be. On the 6th day of their journey, they arrived at a small cave nestled deep in the mountains. The entrance was hidden by thick foliage, and Ilara nearly missed it in the growing darkness. Thomas pushed aside the branches, revealing the opening, and led her inside. The cave was dark and cold, but it offered them shelter from the relentless winds outside. "We'll rest here tonight," Thomas said as they entered the cave. "The rebels should be close by. We just need to be careful. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves." Ilara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had always been taught to trust in the loyalty of her people, to believe that the rebels would come to her aid. But after everything she had seen, after the betrayal and loss, she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. The world had changed, and so had the people in it. As night fell, Ilara sat against the cold stone wall, trying to get some rest. Thomas was at the entrance of the cave, his posture tense as he kept watch. The sound of the wind howling outside filled the silence, and Ilara found herself lost in thought. Her father's face seemed to haunt her, his eyes filled with the weight of their kingdom's downfall. Had she done enough to prevent this? Had she failed him? But no, she couldn't think like that. If there was one thing her father had taught her, it was to never give up, no matter how dark things became. If she was to lead again, she would have to fight for it. She would have to become the leader Elendor needed, even if she had to do it in a world that no longer resembled the one she had once known. She closed her eyes, the cold seeping into her bones, and tried to sleep. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept into the cave, Thomas stood up and stretched, his body stiff from the cold. He turned to Ilara, his face serious as always. "We're going to meet them today," he said. "The rebels should be nearby." Ilara nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had known this day would come, the moment when they would find the people who might be able to help her reclaim her kingdom. She didn't know what to expect, but she hoped that the rebels would understand the gravity of the situation. If they were to succeed, they would need more than just strength. They would need unity, and they would need to trust her. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked, his gaze searching hers. Ilara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I have no choice." The cave offered little comfort, but the knowledge that the rebels were close gave her the strength to move forward. They gathered their things quickly, and Thomas led the way out of the cave, Ilara following closely behind. The path through the mountains was treacherous, narrow in places and steep in others. The air grew thinner as they ascended, and Ilara found herself struggling to keep up. She had never been accustomed to this kind of travel, and the harsh conditions made her feel more fragile than she ever had before. But she refused to show weakness. She had to be strong for herself and for the people she still believed in. After several hours of climbing, they reached a high ridge that overlooked a small valley below. In the valley, hidden among the trees, was a camp, small but well organized. Smoke rose from a fire in the center, and Ilara could make out the shapes of several people moving around. There was a sense of purpose in their movements, as if they had a plan, a mission. Thomas turned to her. "Stay close. These are the rebels. They're not all friendly, but they'll listen." Alara nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel the weight of her role pressing down on her. She had to make them believe in her, believe in their cause. This was her moment, the moment where everything would change. They descended into the valley, and as they approached the camp, a figure stepped forward to meet them. A tall man, his face hardened by years of battle. His eyes were sharp, and his posture was that of someone who had seen much pain and loss. "You must be the princess," the man said, his voice rough. Alara stood tall despite the nerves that threatened to shake her. "I am," she replied, her voice steady, "and I need your help." The man eyed her for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me," he said. "We'll talk." Thomas stayed by her side as they followed the man to a small fire at the center of the camp. There were others gathered around the fire, men and women, their faces weary but determined. Alara could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, waiting to see if she was truly who she claimed to be. The man sat down by the fire and motioned for Alara to do the same. "What is it you want, princess?" he asked, his tone more curious than hostile. Alara took a deep breath. "I want to reclaim my kingdom," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I want to fight back against the invaders and restore Elendor." The group was silent for a long moment, the fire crackling in the background. Alara could see the hesitation in their eyes, the doubt that lingered in the air. The rebels were not fools. They had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and they had no reason to trust a princess who had lost everything. But then, one of the women in the group spoke. "And why should we trust you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You're a royal. You've lived a life of luxury while we've fought for survival. What makes you think we should follow you?" Alara's heart tightened, but she refused to let the doubt show on her face. "Because I'm the last of my bloodline," she said, her voice strong. "Because Elendor is my home, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to bring it back." There was a long silence as the rebels exchanged glances. Finally, the man who had greeted them earlier spoke again. "We'll help you," he said, his voice grim. "But you have to prove you're more than just a princess. You have to show us that you're ready to fight for Elendor, not for yourself." Alara nodded, determination flooding her veins. She had already lost everything. But she would not lose this fight. She would prove that she was not just a princess. She was a leader, and she would do whatever it took to bring her kingdom back. The days following their arrival at the rebel camp were filled with uncertainty, but also with purpose. Alara had made a promise to herself. She would no longer be just a princess. She would be a leader, someone who could inspire the broken remnants of Elendor's people to rise again. But the road ahead was not an easy one. The rebels were hesitant, and the world was far from kind. They had suffered too many losses to trust a royal with their future. It had been 5 days since Alara's meeting with the rebel leaders, and she could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down on her. But she also felt something else. Hope. Slowly, it was growing in her heart. The camp was small, but the people were strong, stronger than Alara had realized at first. These men and women were the last line of defense, fighting against invaders who seemed unstoppable. Their scars weren't just physical. They had endured the pain of watching their homes fall, their families lost, their lives ripped away by war. As the days passed, Alara began to train with them. Thomas had always known how to fight, but Alara had been raised to lead with words, not swords. But now, words felt hollow. She had to prove herself, not just to the rebels, but to herself. She needed to show them that she wasn't the fragile princess they had once heard of. She was the last hope of Elendor, and she would not let them down. The first day of training was rough. She struggled with the weight of the sword, the awkwardness of her stance. The rebels watched her, some with pity, others with skepticism. But Alara kept pushing herself, determined to do whatever it took. Every swing of the blade, every drop of sweat was a small victory. It was her way of taking back control. With each passing day, she grew stronger. Her movements became more fluid, more confident. She wasn't just learning to fight. She was learning to fight for something greater than herself. On the 6th day, the rebel leader called a meeting. Alara stood at the front of the group, alongside Thomas and the other commanders. The fire in the center of the camp crackled as the wind swept through the valley. Alara could feel the tension in the air, the quiet hum of expectation. This was the moment where everything would either fall into place or crumble. "We've trained enough," the leader said, his voice low and firm. "We can't afford to wait any longer. The enemy is growing stronger by the day. We have one shot at this, and we can't waste it." Alara's heart raced. She could feel the eyes of the rebels on her, waiting to see how she would react. For the first time since the fall of Elendor, she felt a sense of responsibility that was not just about her survival. It was about the survival of everyone who had been left behind. The refugees, the lost soldiers, the broken cities, they all depended on this. "We'll attack the invaders' supply lines," she said, her voice steady but with an underlying urgency. "We take their resources and we make them feel what it's like to be on the losing side for once. We'll strike fast and leave no trace. They won't know what hit them." The rebels exchanged glances, murmurs running through the crowd. Alara could see that some were still unsure, but others nodded, their faces hardening with determination. They had lost so much already. What did they have left to fear? Thomas stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. "The princess speaks the truth. The invaders are not invincible. If we strike them at their weakest point, we can break their hold on Elendor." The leader of the rebels stepped forward, looking at Alara with a mixture of skepticism and respect. "You think they'll let us take their supply lines without retaliation? We've been at this too long to believe that we can just attack and walk away unscathed." "We will fight them," Alara replied, her voice strong. "We will show them that Elendor is not dead. As long as there is one of us left to fight, there is hope, and with hope we will rise again." The leader looked her over carefully, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "We'll follow your plan, but know this, if we fail, we all die. You're the one leading us, don't forget that." Alara swallowed hard but stood tall. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of her decision hung heavily in the air, but she had made up her mind. She would lead them into battle, and she would give everything she had to reclaim her kingdom. The next few days were filled with preparation. The rebels moved quickly, gathering supplies and organizing into small, efficient units. Alara worked alongside them, learning the intricacies of combat and strategy. Thomas, ever the silent guide, offered his advice when necessary, but he trusted her decisions. Slowly, she began to realize that the responsibility she had once feared was now her greatest strength. When the day of the attack came, Alara stood at the front of the group, her sword in hand, her heart steady. She looked out over the rebels, their faces determined and fierce, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like the leader she had been born to be. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their home, their future, and the legacy of Elendor. The journey to the invaders' supply camp was long and dangerous. They moved under the cover of night, using the shadows to hide their movements. Alara led the group through the rugged terrain, her senses heightened as she kept an eye out for enemy scouts. They made their way through the forest, their footsteps soft against the ground, the only sound the rustle of the wind through the trees. When they finally reached the supply camp, Alara's heart pounded in her chest. The camp was larger than she had expected, guarded by a few dozen soldiers, but they were tired, unaware of the threat that was closing in on them. This was their chance. Alara signaled to the rebels and the attack began. The battle was swift and brutal. Alara fought with everything she had, her sword flashing in the moonlight as she cut through the enemy soldiers. She moved with precision, her training paying off as she navigated the chaos of the battle. Thomas was by her side, his sword a blur of motion as he protected her from any attacks. Together, they moved like one, a single unit of force and resolve. The rebels fought with a fury they had never known before. They weren't just defending their homes, they were fighting for the future of Elendor. And with each strike, with each victory, Alara knew that they were closer to reclaiming what they had lost. By the time the battle ended, the supply lines had been destroyed, and the invaders had been thrown into disarray. The rebels stood victorious, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, but their eyes shining with the fire of triumph. The camp had been overrun, and Alara felt a rush of pride and relief. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas gave her a rare smile, his eyes gleaming with approval. "Yes, Princess, we did." But even in this moment of victory, Alara knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The enemy would regroup and they would come again, but Alara was ready. She had proved to herself and to everyone else that she was no longer the fragile princess she had once been. She was a leader, and Elendor would rise again.